When you think of desert, what comes to your mind? Endless sand, scorching heat, no signs of life? Well, welcome to Xinjiang, where deserts are not dying.
At first, moving millions of live fish into one of the driest places on Earth sounded like a scientific gamble. But what began as a bold idea by China slowly turned into something unexpected. In a land where water vanished faster than hope, these fish were left to face a desert that swallowed everything. As months passed, the researchers monitored the site, unsure if life could endure such harsh conditions. What they found after 1 year changed the entire project and led to a new discovery. Join us as we delve into the details of this risky experiment. A new means of sustainability. When the story first spread about China moving millions of live fish into the heart of a desert, many people tried to picture how such a plan even began. It sounded like a scene from a far-off future, yet the work had started long before anyone heard about it. The idea did not come up overnight. It grew slowly, as China watched its coasts change year after year. The country had depended on the sea for a long time, but the sea was not the same anymore. As the problems rose, planners knew they had to think in a new way, and so they began to build a path that led inland, far from waves and salt winds, into a place shaped by heat and sand. China had reached a point where feeding its people had become harder than before. The nation expanded its cities, factories, and ports, and all of this pushed the environment in ways no one expected. Coastlines that once seemed endless began to suffer. Entire stretches of water that once produced shrimp, crab, and salmon started to fall apart under the weight of demand. Climate change pushed the waters to warm up, and this shift broke many natural cycles that fish relied on. As the ocean changed, China found itself forced to look for answers away from the coast. In the early years of the 2020s, marine scientists began laying out reports that showed how fast the trouble was spreading. They warned that fish, which we needed cold waters, could not survive the rising temperatures. They pointed out how coral systems were bleaching and breaking down, how plastic waste drifted across the surface, and how chemicals from factories washed into bays. Each year, the coastal systems grew less stable, and each year, China watched the numbers drop as harvests grew smaller and storms grew stronger. At the same time, global studies showed a future where seafood would not meet demand. International groups tracked patterns and put together graphs that pointed toward shortages across the globe. These reports projected that the world would eat far more fish in the coming decades, while natural stocks would fall. China, being the largest consumer of seafood on Earth, could not ignore these signs. If the world was heading into a long period of scarcity, China would be hit hardest. It had spent years building the world's biggest aquaculture industry, but even that system could not stand alone. Typhoons struck, more often and with more force. Red tide events rose up without warning and wiped out entire seasons of work in a single night. Many farms near the coast tried to build stronger barriers, but nature pushed harder. Planners in China sat down and tried to map out long-term paths that could keep food production safe. They looked through old models and new models, comparing coastal risks with inland opportunities. They reached a point where they had to shift their strategy. They needed controlled systems far from the changing sea, systems that would not depend on the mood of the weather. This thinking led them toward inland aquaculture. The idea was simple on paper, but complex in practice. Fish would be raised in places where temperature, water quality, and nutrients could be managed each day. Engineers worked out ways to mix artificial seawater that matched the oceans in exact detail. Researchers studied how to build basins that kept heat out and held water in. By placing these farms inland, China could push away from the unpredictable conditions of the open sea. It could build up a stable supply chain and reduce the pressure on its coastal zones. The plan also connected with the country's long-term push to grow more of its own food and depend less on imports. Buying seafood from faraway regions had grown harder due to trade tensions, prices, and shipping delays. An inland system could solve these problems by keeping the entire process under local control. This shift would give China a stronger hold over its food future and also protect the country from sudden disruptions in global markets. Even though the change required money, labor, and scientific work, the long-term benefits stretched far beyond the early challenges. Environmental groups in China supported the change as well. They understood that traditional ocean farming could create waste that drifted into open waters. They wanted to build systems that kept the environment healthier than before. Inland, systems could clean and reuse water over and over. They could manage nutrients in ways the open sea could not. They could lower disease risks and protect wild species. It was a chance to build something cleaner, safer, and more productive than the old methods. There was also a deeper ambition behind the project. Scientists wanted to show that food could be produced in places once dismissed as useless. They wanted to take land that could not grow crops and turn it into a new source of life. They believed that if people could build marine systems on dry ground, then many regions of the world could solve their own food struggles. Nations facing droughts, heat waves, and soil damage could learn from this experiment. If it worked, it could reshape how the world thought about food production. But even with all this planning, one problem stood in the way. Fish needed water, and deserts were known for not having enough of it. Engineers and researchers had to look for places where new technology could work. Their search led them west, toward Xinjiang, a region shaped by vast distances and harsh landscapes. There, beneath the endless stretch of the Taklamakan, they believed they could find water trapped deep underground. They hoped they could bring it up, treat it, and use it to support a new kind of farm that had never existed before. And so the work began, not with crowds or reporters, but with machines drilling into ancient layers of earth. As China pushed this project forward, the rest of the world watched, unsure of how a desert could hold life from the sea. Yet China kept moving, determined to build a new future in a place no one expected. And what they soon discovered would change everything, with the desert's secret river. On reaching Xinjiang, the team felt a strong sense of uncertainty move through them as they looked at the huge sand world before them. The desert showed no clear sign of life. Still, they knew the project could not fall apart because too many years of planning had built up to this moment. They needed to find out if the land was hiding something deep below. Xinjiang held a strange mix of danger and potential because its shape and history had formed over thousands of years. The region rested inside a huge basin wrapped by 3 giant mountain ranges, each holding old secrets built by nature itself. To the north stood the Tian Shan Mountains, rising in strong ridges that caught snow through the long winters. To the south lay the Kunlun Range, pushing up against the basin like a massive wall. To the northwest stretched the Altai Mountains with their own cold heights and frozen layers. These mountain chains kept huge glaciers locked within them, and those glaciers stored millions of cubic meters of fresh water that did not stay still forever. When summer arrived and temperatures rose, the ice began to melt and send water down narrow paths carved by nature over time. Much of this meltwater did not stay above ground. Instead, it slipped into cracks, tunnels, and deep passages before sinking under sand and stone. Over thousands of years, these steady cycles built a hidden world of flowing water beneath the desert. It formed aquifers, underground channels, and lost streams that stayed covered by thick layers of shifting sand. The first hints of this underground world came from a small hydrology group that worked with China's early desert research team. They began taking soil samples, checking ground temperatures, and gathering data that pointed toward moisture deep underground. Back in 2018, their samples showed different results each time, so no one felt sure about anything. Even so, something kept pulling the team forward. The numbers and readings pushed them to think beyond what they could see on the surface. If a hidden water network truly ran through the ground, it could change everything they believed about the Taklamakan. Older experts dismissed the early findings because they did not trust the instruments or the unusual readings. They argued that any water under the desert was either too deep or too salty to help the project move ahead. The younger researchers did not want to give up. They brought in new tools, new systems, and newer technologies to find out what the land was truly holding. From 2018 to 2022, the Chinese Academy of Sciences launched a wide mapping program. They used satellite radar to scan from above and ground sensors to push signals into the earth. The data began forming lines, shapes, and patterns that looked nothing like what they expected. Under the endless sand, the machines detected large underground bodies filled with moving water. These formations were not tiny pockets or dried-out remains. They were strong aquifers, connected to mountain glaciers that released water every year. The ground below the desert held far more life than anyone thought. The team felt as if they had found a buried sea hidden under the dry earth. They knew they had to prove everything through drilling. They marked the strongest sensor readings and set up machines to break through layers of sand. The drilling rigs pushed down slowly, meter by meter, as the team waited for signs of success. Each drilling attempt carried tension because no one knew what would happen. When one of the wells finally hit water, the ground released a strong rush of cold, clear liquid. The workers celebrated because this was no longer a theory. It was something real that they could touch, measure, and build upon. The next step involved deep testing. Hydrologists studied the water's temperature, clarity, oxygen level, and mineral balance. The results showed that the underground system held water that could support life without heavy treatment. Temperatures between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius matched what many species preferred in natural river environments. The oxygen level stayed stable, and the minerals did not create harmful conditions. This gave the researchers a strong base for future planning. History also joined their progress in a surprising way. Some experts on the team remembered stories of the old Kharez tunnels that early settlers built in the same region. Those tunnels served as lifelines that pulled water from the mountains to the towns long ago. Modern researchers now walked paths shaped by people before them. This idea pushed them to keep working harder. Once the water source was confirmed and tested, the project shifted from theory to action. The team needed to shape the underground resource into something that could support fish. The desert environment demanded strong systems that could hold up against heat, dryness, and shifting sand. Engineers started to draw out structures that could reach down, pull water up, and move it into controlled sections built for aquatic growth. The workers pushed through long days, lifted heavy equipment, and fixed new Abuvayar problems as the desert reacted to everything they did. Every step helped them build a system that turned hidden water into living space. What started as doubt grew into a working vision, and as the project took shape, the researchers understood that they had opened up a part of the desert that had stayed unseen for ages, preparing the land for a new kind of life that no one expected to rise from such a place. From sand to sea, the arrival of the first aircraft in the desert was not just an ordinary event. It was a point where long planning finally stepped into real ground. The long stretch of sand in the Taklamakan looked endless, and the sky gave no sign of change. Even so, the team moved across the open land and set up their equipment as the aircraft lowered its wheels. They worked out plans, checked readings, and made sure every step lined up with months of preparation. They had come with one purpose, and they pushed forward to make it work. Inside the aircraft, massive tanks held thousands of small fish. Each tank carried water, treated with oxygen, and kept under strict temperature control. The scientists got to work as soon as the aircraft stopped, moving tools, checking gauges, and setting up pumps. They spread out across the site and worked through their lists. They knew nothing in this desert could support life on its own, so they had to build everything from scratch. The approval from authorities in early 2023 had pushed them to act fast and move supplies inland. Two main locations had been picked for the project, both near Aral City and Tamshuk. These places sat above underground water sources, and the land allowed engineers to carve out large artificial basins. The work crews dug deep into the ground, shaped the earth, and laid thick synthetic liners across the bottom. These liners stopped water from leaking away, and layers of gravel and clay helped protect them from heat and sharp edges. The workers moved back and forth across the wide pits, making sure nothing was loose or out of place. After sealing the basins, the team linked them to pumping systems that pulled clean underground water into the ponds. The water rose slowly and spread across the liners, filling the empty space. Aeration equipment kept the water moving and brought in the oxygen needed to support life. Sensors watched over every change, recording numbers on temperature, pH, and salinity. The researchers stayed close to the screens and wrote down every shift. They knew that even a small change in one reading could break the balance they needed for the experiment. The hardest part involved turning fresh water into something close to seawater. Marine species needed very exact mineral levels, so chemists worked through long days in their temporary labs. They mixed sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium into the water and checked how each batch behaved. They went through repeated tests and adjusted the formula until the balance grew steady. At one point, the magnesium level rose too far, and the microorganisms they added showed signs of stress. The team worked through several days of corrections until the numbers finally lined up with natural seawater. While chemists handled the mix of minerals, microbiologists built the biological base of the ponds. They introduced salt-tolerant bacteria that thrived in high salinity environments. These organisms broke down waste and produced nutrients for aquatic plants, helping keep the water healthy. Without this layer of life, the ponds would have filled up with harmful compounds. Engineers added crushed basalt and fine clay to help neutralize salts rising from the desert soil. This extra step kept the natural desert minerals from upsetting the chemistry of the artificial ponds and helped hold the balance steady. Temperature control was another difficult task. Daytime heat in the desert often pushed toward 40 degrees Celsius, which placed the aquatic life at risk. Engineers built wide shade structures across the ponds and set up cooling towers that dropped water temperature through controlled evaporation. The team watched the readings rise and fall and made changes to keep the system steady. Some days they worked through the night, moving equipment around and adjusting valves, because they knew the fish would not survive if the environment drifted out of range. By late summer of 2023, the trial basins reached the right chemical and biological balance. The sensors showed stable numbers, the microbes worked as expected, and the cooling systems kept temperatures from rising too far. Aircraft arrived with containers of live fish, fry, and young shellfish. Technicians checked the temperature inside each container and compared it to the water inside the new ponds. They carried the containers toward the edges of the basins and moved slowly to reduce stress on the fishes. The fish entered the water and drifted near the surface as they adjusted to the new environment. The team stood back and watched them move in small groups. After a short time, the fish began to swim deeper and spread across the basin. The team looked across the water and understood the importance of what had just happened. Their long effort had brought life into a place where none existed before. Still, they knew the experiment had only begun, and every change could undo their work if they failed to keep everything under control. Engineering life against the odds. The days that followed moved slowly for the engineering team as they worked through long hours beside the desert ponds. They checked each reading again and again, making sure nothing slipped out of range. They wrote down temperature levels, tracked oxygen changes, and measured salinity until the numbers almost felt like part of their own thoughts. At first, the fish reacted poorly, drifting toward the strong bursts of air that pushed oxygen into the water. A few even drifted upward, as if unsure of how to make sense of the new space built for them. Those early moments felt heavy for the scientists, who stayed near the ponds and watched the fish move in slow, uneven patterns. The unfamiliar water made some fish turn in circles, as though trying to figure out which way to go. Hours passed without any clear improvement, and the team kept working through their checklists, adjusting pumps, moving sensors, and trying to bring the system into balance. The desert sun pushed down on everyone, and the tension made each minute stretch out as they waited for signs that the fish were beginning to adjust. A difference finally began to occur after several days of monitoring and fine-tuning. The fish started to spread out across the ponds instead of gathering in tight groups. They swam in smoother patterns and began feeding on tiny particles drifting through the water. The system they had built started to behave like something alive, rather than something controlled by wires and machines. The shift marked the beginning of a new understanding that life could take shape even in a place known for unproductivity. Once the first species adapted, a larger question rose to the surface. The team needed to find out if the system could support delicate fish that reacted badly to even the smallest change. They decided to bring in salmon, a species known for needing water that stayed cold, rich in oxygen, and stable at all times. Even a slight shift in temperature or pH could bring sudden problems. If salmon managed to grow in these desert conditions, the team would know the system could support almost any species they decided to raise in the future. To prepare for the new stage, the biologists chose reservoirs in Nilka County, a region filled with water melting down from the Tian Shan Mountains. This water stayed near 12 degrees Celsius through all seasons, matching the natural places where salmon grew in coastal or northern rivers. The team set up floating cages across several points in the reservoirs. The frames were built from strong, lightweight materials, and the nets allowed the cold water to flow through while keeping the fish inside. They placed the cages at different depths, letting them test how the fish handled changes in pressure and light. The setup grew more advanced as the scientists installed underwater cameras that fed live footage into a central data hub. Every motion the salmon made was recorded and reviewed, helping the team adjust the system step by step. Feeding also needed careful control, so they set up automated feeders that dropped tiny pellets into the cages at intervals. Sensors showed how fast the pellets disappeared, and artificial intelligence software changed the feeding rate based on how active the fish were. This allowed the fish to move through their new environment without feeling overwhelmed. During the first stage of the trial, progress moved slowly. Growth rates stayed below the expected line, and some fish swam in short, uneven patterns that suggested stress. The scientists worked through each problem by adjusting pumps, shifting the cages, and checking oxygen levels again and again. As the days passed, the system settled, and the fish began to respond. By the end of the third month, sample tests showed that the salmon held the same blood oxygen levels as those raised in natural coastal conditions, something the team had hoped for but never counted on with full certainty. The next months brought results that changed the direction of the entire project. The salmon not only lived in the artificial seawater, but also thrived at a rate no one expected. The ecosystem inside the reservoirs began to build itself. Fish waste fed tiny organisms, and those organisms absorbed extra carbon and nitrogen, helping the water stay clean without heavy mechanical support. The cycle grew stronger each week, reducing the need for artificial filters. For the first time, the reservoirs acted like self-balancing aquatic systems instead of engineered experiments. By the time the first cycle reached its end, the results exceeded all predictions. Full-sized salmon usually took 3 years to reach harvest weight, but these fish reached market size in 18 months. The lack of predators and stable conditions helped them grow faster than they would have in the wild. The harvest of Y reached more than 7,000 tons, a number once considered unrealistic for an inland desert region. With these results secured, the team began to shift their mission toward larger goals, knowing they had opened a path that could change inland aquaculture across the world. Fish farming revolution. A new phase of work began once the desert fish farms started showing results that exceeded early expectations. The early worry about whether fish could adapt to such harsh land began to fade, and a different goal began to rise. The real challenge turned into long-term control, steady output, and the removal of human mistakes that could disrupt everything. This shift pushed the entire project into a future powered by machines, sensors, and smarter ways of managing every drop of water in the region. Across the desert, every pond and reservoir began to change as engineers started fitting them with layers of digital equipment. What once looked like a simple field experiment grew into a complex system shaped by technology. Every water body turned into a point of data, sending information to a central brain that never slept. These sensors measured oxygen, salinity, pH levels, temperature, and water clarity, and they kept sending updates to help the system pick up patterns and spot issues before they could spread. All this information poured into a main control center that received thousands of readings each minute. When any number drifted even slightly, the system reacted right away. If oxygen began to fall, pumps switched on. If the temperature began to rise, cooling units kicked in to bring things back to balance. there was no need to walk around with tools or rely on guesswork. The farms began to run themselves through quick adjustments that kept the fish safe and growing at a steady rate. At the heart of the operation sat an artificial intelligence platform built to learn from everything it observed. It processed huge waves of data each day, studying fish movement, feeding habits, and chemical changes in the water. When it spotted a shift that hinted at possible trouble, it adjusted feeding times, water flow, and lighting until the problem faded. This approach helped protect entire batches of fish from sudden shifts in the environment. Edge computing units placed at each site helped local systems carry out these changes instantly, even in parts of the desert where signal strength was weak. These local processors learned daily patterns. They picked up when oxygen usually began to drop, especially before dawn when plants used oxygen faster. Instead of waiting for a warning, the processors activated pumps just before levels began to fall. This kind of anticipation turned each farm into a self-managing system that ran smoothly, with little need for workers to step in. The farms became stronger and more adaptable because the machines learned to react before trouble had time to build. Satellite links was another support. The system used the Beidou satellite network to check temperature changes, air movement, and snowmelt coming from nearby mountains. The AI used this information to predict how much fresh water would flow into the reservoirs during warmer months. With this knowledge, it adjusted water use and kept salinity and temperature steady. Satellites helped detect outside changes long before they reached the ponds, giving the farms a broader understanding of the land around them. The energy used to run the entire network also came from a smart system. Solar panels spread along the ponds, gathered power throughout the day. The farms used this power to run pumps, filters, and feeders, and the extra energy was stored for use after sunset. This setup reduced fuel use and made the project environmentally friendly, helping it run without extra pressure on natural resources. Food safety and tracking joined the system through blockchain methods. Each fish received a digital ID from the moment it entered the pond. Every feeding record, health check, and movement was entered into a system that buyers could access. This process ensured that every product could be traced back to its exact conditions. It also helped build trust among customers, especially in markets that demanded strong proof of safety and quality. With all these parts working together, production increased at a rate faster than anyone expected. A single processing plant handled tons of fish per day with almost no waste. Facilities kept the temperature steady at 5 degrees Celsius, and machines worked around the clock to move fish through washing, sorting, and packing lines. The speed and accuracy of this system helped raise profit and reduce loss. It wasn't long before comparisons with traditional coastal farms began to appear. Reports showed that inland desert farms had lower disease rates, better growth, and higher feed efficiency than many long-established farms across the world. The early experiment that once seemed unrealistic slowly turned into an example for the global fish farming industry. As the first year reached its end, the farms prepared for their first major harvest, marking a turning point in the entire project. The desert changed as the harvest season approached. Rows of ponds stretched across the landscape, and machines moved above the water as they prepared for the busy weeks ahead. The first large harvest created a scene that felt new to everyone watching. Salmon and groupers shimmered in the sun as machines lifted them from the ponds. Workers guided equipment, checked the fish, and kept the process running at a steady pace. The mix of natural movement and mechanical rhythm filled the area as the desert turned into a center of activity. Fish moved from pond to processing room in only a few minutes. Automated lines cleaned, sorted, and packed them without slowing down. The cold chain kept temperatures low from start to finish, protecting freshness. Once packed, the fish were placed into waiting trucks that carried them toward air freight terminals. Within hours, shipments reached Urumqi and were loaded onto planes heading to major cities. By the next day, the fish arrived in restaurants in Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen. Chefs found the quality consistent because water conditions had been controlled with great care. The smooth flow from pond to plate helped distributors save time and reduce losses. This new method changed how long-distance seafood transport could work. By the end of 2024, online orders from the Ezen desert farms grew, supported by videos and live streams that showed the harvest taking place under the desert sun. The idea of desert fishery began to stand for modern thinking and sustainable food production, marking a new chapter for the region and the industry. What are your thoughts on the success of this new food sustainability program? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.